Sarah Perry and Ian Cheng are collaborators. Sarah for about 6 years now, and Ian for just over a year. We've been collaborating on writing projects on my blog. And we're going to be talking about time, which I think all three of us have been interested in for quite a while in different ways. And let me start with just a couple of quick context-setting remarks here. So temporality is one of those words that's kind of like pretentiously academic, and if you look around in the literature, you'll find lots of pretentious usages. But for this conversation, let's agree that temporality is to time as architecture is to space. So just think of it as a way to shape your experience of time using human inventions and artifacts. So that's our definition for the evening. If you want to argue with me about it, see me later. But that's architecture for time. And before we get started, I do want to thank all the staff who've been really working hard to pull this event together. Like, this is way more over the top than I'm used to, and I think my fellow panelists are used to. But Rachel, who pulled this event together, Jody, Sarah, and let's see, Deanna, who I think pulled this event together. So thank you. All right. Before we get started, I have a little audience prompt for you guys to sort of get you thinking in a slightly more personal way about temporality. So 2 questions. 1, what is the biggest story you can think of where you are an active participant? That's question number 1. In my case, for example, it would be Silicon Valley technology. So I'm part of that story because I work in that economy and sector. So that's one question. Second question, what for you is the lowest level experience of a TikTok-like phenomenon that's like time? So, few of us wear watches anymore. I don't. Most of us don't anymore. And for all of us, other kind of like event streams have replaced our experience of TikToking of clocks. For me, it's Twitter. So just following the Twitter feed and the flow of like little tweets from my friends, that's my clock now. So those are the 2 questions. So I'd like you to take 20 seconds to think about your highest level story where you have a role and your lowest level clock-like signal in your life, and share it with your neighbor in the next 20 seconds. All right.
I think I'm diaper changers.
All right. Let's bring it back in, folks. All right. People have a lot to say about their stories. All right, my job here is done. Okay, guys, let's bring it back in. Okay, so what I'd like you to do is, as you hear us talk, just keep your own personal temporality in mind and the story and the TikTok signals in your life. Just kind of think about what you're hearing up here on stage in the context of that. So that's hopefully a way to, make this a little more personal and also give you some conversation fodder. Some quick background. I'm a blogger. My background is as an engineer. I'm an aerospace engineer, and I first got interested in time back when I was doing my PhD and postdoc in control theory, where time plays a big role. And the work I was doing at the time was for command and control systems in the Air Force. And time plays a big role in how you manage action on the battlefield. And the work that came out of my postdoc, I turned it into a book. That's this book, Tempo. It's in the slideshow rotation. So that's me. That's how I got into time. Sarah Perry, she's an urban planning and law degree. So her background is kind of eclectic. And she's been blogging for, more than a decade, same as me. And her first blog was a blog called View from Hell, which was about the ethics of suicide and birth. So her book, Every Cradle is a Grave, is about the ethics of birth and suicide, which are, of course, very important bookends of time, right? And finally, Ian Cheng is a rising star in the art world, and he's best known for building artworks that can be best described as video games that play themselves. So they're like simulations built out of game engines that create worlds and unfold in somewhat sort of unpredictable, random ways. And he's kind of not just developed the works, which there's a trilogy of works called Emissaries, and he has another work called Bag of Beliefs. And he's written this book, Emissaries Guide to Worlding, which is about his art practice. And I have all 3 books up here. My cue cards again. Oh, there. Thank you. I'm not used to holding 2 things at once. But I'm actually going to pass these books around, pass them around the room. Please make sure they come back to the stage, just so you can. And there's a rotation of images up there that's kind of like drawn from all 3 of our works. So some of the cartoon-like images you see, they're like screenshots from Ian's simulations. Some of the photographs are photographs Sarah has used in several of her writings. And my contribution is the screenshot from Futurama and the South Park and Rick and Morty. So I had to throw something of mine in there. OK, so let's get started with the conversation. So like I said, Ian's work can be described as video games that play themselves. And Sarah, in her book, one of her lines is, if life were a video game, would it be worth playing? So that's kind of like an interesting opposition, and that's kind of why I thought it would be fun to have them both on the same stage talking about basically the same questions. So I want to get started with you, Ian. Ian, your career started at ILM in the traditional movie industry, CGI, stuff like that, and then at some point you discovered video games as a creative medium and built simulations. So can you sort of walk us through your history of exploring those media and how time behaves differently in them?
Yeah, sure. So my first job out of college was working on Industrial Light and Magic, which is George Lucas's visual effects studio. And I was at rung 0, basically training other VFX artists how to use their proprietary software. But they started doing a lot of motion capture stuff, really innovative stuff to do with like Pirates of the Caribbean. And a certain point came about a year into it where I felt, it's like in the midst of people who are technically genius and also artistically super creative, but they were telling me about the short film that they were working on or the sculpture project that they'd be working on, and they'd be working on it since Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi, and this was 2007. And I freaked out, and I thought, I need to essentially take control of my own time again and figure out an art practice. So the very first work I made was a motion capture animation, but it became very, 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 very specific where, as you know, anyone who does animation, you can perfect every millisecond of the animation forever until someone tells you to stop. And I thought, I can't live that hell again, so I started experimenting with a video game engine that could essentially animate itself. And at the same time, I was thinking more and more about artworks that had a sense of aliveness, that had a sense of self-animation, that had a sense that it could surprise me as an author and you as the viewer. And so I began pursuing this simulation path. And for me, that really broke open, on a temporal level, the ability to make an artwork that could essentially be of infinite duration and both infinitely boring and surprising in minor, interesting ways. And kind of escape this hell of being a very linear animator.
And you mentioned the word boringness, and that's one thing I've experienced building simulations is on the engineering side, where there's long stretches of boredom where nothing happens. Is that an artistic problem you have to deal with?
Yeah, but I have a pet corgi, and when I watch him sleep, it's the most mundane, predictable thing you've ever seen. But every little twitch that's a variation of the previous night's twitch is a revelation. And so when you lower the expectation of what counts as interestingness, little revelations become mind-blowing. So it became in this territory.
All right. Sarah, you and I, when we first started collaborating on my blog, Ribbon Farm, among your early articles that you wrote a lot about Disneyland and other such kind of fake-built environments, and you've also been heavily influenced by Christopher Alexander's work. So how do you think spatial environment design affects temporality and experience of time on the whole spectrum, like from fake to real?
So, say you're at an art museum. How do you know what to look at? Like, do you look at the floor? Do you look at the ceiling? Probably not. There will be things like this guy, and they're in a frame, right? Sorry. They're often the fancier frame, the bigger the frame, maybe that indicates something about the context of the work, that it's, with a fancier frame, maybe it's more worth looking at. It's a little bit of a clue. And that it's at eye level or something, that it's otherwise sort of presented in a particular way, as opposed to anywhere else it could be. It's not cluttered by something blocking it. So what's the best part of Disneyland? Overstimulation. the characters, really? Characters? I mean, maybe they're all right. That's part of the theme park aspect, that having a theme instead of having like happiness. I love it. Yeah. So I would say the best part of Disneyland is the rides, but nobody's gonna say that because it's too obvious. So what are the best rides though? Like, how do you know what's a good ride? Because it's the line, yeah. So the line is kind of acting like a frame in time. And the temporal phenomenon of going through the line, signaling to yourself is really important. Other people around you, obviously they're going through this process too. In every ritual, there's some kind of sacrifice, and the most common one is time. So you sacrifice this time to go into this place. It's set apart by having this line. You have to go through this process to get to it. Ian was just telling me there's a new Star Wars area that they've optimized so much. One of the rides you get through like instantly, and people interpret it as being a bad ride because there's no line for it. So I think the optimal amount of line is not zero. The optimal amount of suffering probably is not zero, even in a really fake place like Disneyland. So yeah, I guess that's my answer.
And when we were sort of discussing this theme in preparation for this conversation, all of us gravitated on the South Park line ride. I don't know if you guys have seen this episode of South Park where there's a carnival and the entire joke is the whole ride is the line. Just waiting in the line is the experience of the line.
So the proper size of a line is not 100% of the ride. It's somewhere between 10% to 90% maybe.
Yeah. All right, back to you, Ian. So in your series of simulations, so Ian has a trilogy of simulations that are like thousands of years apart, but set in the same situation. And the first of these is a small community living in the shadow of a volcano that's about to explode, right? So Ian, talk about how communities construct time, especially in relation to like external events like a volcano erupting, and how you turn that into a simulation.
Yeah, sure. So that work was called Emissary and the Squad of Gods, and it was inspired by hearing about these hurricane parties, like in New Orleans, where people would host parties at hearing the news of a pending hurricane, and it's always a bet whether the hurricane will wipe you out or just kind of glide on by. And the parties were a way to, resist moving and to kind of plant your feet down and invite everyone, make a celebratory experience of holding out. Meanwhile, there's always someone crying, like, we gotta move, we gotta move, we gotta move. And so I wanted to build a simulation of this social effect. And so the first simulation from the Emissaries trilogy, all the characters were living in the shadow of a volcano that may or may not erupt, but I gave each character the behavior of essentially doing little rituals that involved the landscape, getting food, making prayers to this one part of the volcano. Meanwhile, there's an emissary character who got hit in the head and didn't have literally those AI scripts in its brain. And so would try to, cry, ring the bell and say everyone should move and try to convince all the other characters, all the other AI agents to leave the simulation. And over time, what would happen is some of these other characters could persuade the emissary character to get off her script, and they would literally, on a technical level, install their ritual script into her, and she would get pulled into a more reactive simulation that had a different duration, doing the rituals that she didn't want to do but was forced to do socially. And vice versa, sometimes she could convert or persuade other characters to get rid of their script and go along with her. And it made me think of this idea that when someone in your community is playing a different game or there's another script in them, they might feel like they're playing the same game as you, but because they're kind of off on this own other beat, you can't trust them as a player in that game. They're playing a different game. And I think in a way you could conflate a little bit game and temporality. Like every game has its own temporality, has its own tools for organizing both objective and subjective time. And I really wanted to create a simulation that kind of dramatized this conflict of being in two different games and two different temporalities.
So would a good summary of that simulation be the emissary character is trying to like be in a story and everybody else's little reactive rituals keep interrupting her story and sort of pulling her to the side, something like that?
Yeah, that's right. Everyone has a kind of almost a parental script of all their daily rituals, and they don't want to interrupt that because the last thing you want to do is ruin the game for everyone. So something like this.
So rituals are kind of your thing, right? So you've been thinking and writing and talking about rituals for a really long time. And one aspect of your ritual sort of explorations really interests me, which is you define failed ritual as the experience of cringe. So cringing, that's an experience of failed sacredness in a ritual. And you got that from the definition of camp, right? Susan Sontag has failed seriousness as the definition of camp. So talk about ritual and failed ritual and how they create time.
Yeah, it's easy. Some parts of ritual are easy to see, like you can see the behaviors happening. You can see maybe there's an architecture to it, and you can copy those kind of superficial things, but there's a layer that's really hard to see, and that's why you see people attempting rituals and doing them in really embarrassing and silly ways, that you have this idea, oh, if I just perform these activities, it'll happen, but the experience is based on all these sort of weird invisible things, like the fact of a sacrifice, the fact that even if it's time, having genuine value. And part of it, I think, is charisma, which I don't have a good sense. I don't have like a definition of it, kind of know it when you see it. But my latest definition of cringe is it's when someone's displaying normal human motivations that we all have to seem high status, to seem important, to even sometimes to be helpful, but without the capacity to kind of observe themselves. So I think it's, and we all, of course, we all have that too. We've all been cringy, but so not knowing that you're supposed to sort of act humble, or not knowing that you're sort of supposed to moderate it, or not realizing that you're not charismatic. So I think that the sort of things that are invisible, like maybe the line is kind of invisible as an ingredient for success, but it is actually hard. I think every ritual works for different reasons. I don't think there's some one analytic analysis of it, but yeah, and there's almost always something missing if there's a cringe experience that sometimes is more interesting than a successful ritual, but I think it's one way to maybe the only way to learn what works in ritual is to try and horribly fail.
So failure in a temporal sense, the way I've been thinking about it since I read your article is a ritual that actually works and everybody's executing perfectly. Like there's a dinner party, everybody knows how to use a fork and knife properly. There's no way to tell time because it's like a timeless experience. But if somebody, say, drops a fork or does some other sort of cringy, sacredness-violating behavior, it actually creates a point in irreversible time that sort of marks it. So do you agree with that take on like
yeah, I like that. That's cool. Yes. No, yeah, it makes it memorable to the extent that it wasn't predictable, something weird happened.
So is predictability an important part of ritual, or?
To some degree, not. I think not that you'd predict how everything would unfold, but yeah, that's an interesting question. What is the level at which you're surprised on? Because you don't predict every single thing the person's going to say, but is there sort of an overall like game, like Ian was saying, that we're either playing or failing to play if there's actually an error? I think you discover that as you go along, what counts as an error.
And there's a little bit of like expectations and how much you can sort of incorporate what's happening in an improv sense. Like I dropped the mic, I forgot the cue cards were in my hand,
awesome.
And depending on my reaction, that could be varying like 0 to 10 on cringe spectrum. I think I was experiencing like a level 3 cringe, but but I mean that's something that marks time in sort of a ritual event, like a bunch of panelists being up on stage going through like a fairly well-known social ritual, right? Okay, so we've talked about social construction of time in the context of like a volcano about to erupt and like more regular ritual. Let's bringing it to a more personal level rather than social. Ian, one of your more recent artworks after Emissaries is Bob, right? Bag of Beliefs. So this is an AI agent you've created. So tell us about Bob and how Bob experiences time.
Yeah, so Bob's this virtual creature, kind of like a Tamagotchi, came from a dream of a snake that would fractalize into a tree. And I thought that could be, if an animal could wear its kind of mental cognitive architecture as its body, you could understand its physical growth as its mental growth. And so I worked really hard on trying to create an AI in the form of a creature, and the creature being itself a kind of composition. And when friends of mine who are painters, they always talk about artworks where you have to mind the edges. And I always thought, if you took a creature as a compositional space, its edge is how it's born and how it dies. And the journey or the life path in between is sort of the content of that life. And so I really wanted to find a structure for that. So I decided I'm going to make Bob this creature. And one of the biggest pain in the asses was to make the AI for Bob in a way that was truthful to something that I thought, at least at an animal level, felt like, I don't know, how an animal would actually learn. So after so much trial and error and much research and a lot of wasted money, my own, and eventually came down to the idea that Bob's essential architecture was that it wanted to minimize surprise in a way, or minimize upset, in the sense that Bob had beliefs, it's called Bag of Beliefs, and it had motivations. And when it pursued something or did something, its motivations were either rewarded by it being not surprised by what happened, or by its expectations being totally upset. And when it got upset, it had to actually deal with its beliefs, update them, and then try again. And I found that this very minimal definition of a creature being upset and then learning to deal with it, for me, became a basic definition of sentience. And it led me, and Bob by no means has sentience or let alone consciousness, but it led me to an appreciation for the problem of sentience and consciousness and the temporality of it. And I realized maybe one idea of consciousness is the voluntary confrontation of upset and then dealing with it when there's no urgency to confront upset or deal with it. So when you have thoughts about something while you're doing something like driving, you're voluntarily destroying some belief inside of you, reconstructing it, maybe simulating another idea about what it could be, little by little, to recreate and resimulate what your beliefs could be in a parallel world. And so Bob was really, for me, a way to appreciate this problem.
So give us an example of the kind of belief Bob had that got violated by surprise.
Bob, just like a child, its very first experiences impact its beliefs because they build on each other. So for example, I started Bob once, I fed him like this kind of gray blob. The gray blob was edible, so I thought, oh shit, gray food this is the stuff of life. Then I gave it a gray bomb. Blew up in its face, all its limbs got torn. It felt a tremendous amount of pain, super upset. Pain, literally physical pain, and then the motion of that upset. Emotion was literally the signal. I found it like a good use, like a technical use of emotion, was the signal to tell its inference engine to update that belief that now something that was gray, it had a rule for what gray was because it learned it from the first experience, applied it incorrectly to this gray bomb. And now it had to create a new rule that somehow distinguished the gray food from the bomb. So then it had to like hold the memory of that gray food and hold the memory of that gray bomb and then decide what was different between them so that it wouldn't do that again. And it made me also realize that memory is not just for remembering. It's for remembering the things that you haven't figured out yet and that really like screwed with you and you haven't resolved. I think this maybe ties more into stuff to do with PTSD and how not re-experiencing deeply traumatic memories actually makes the problem never go away and haunts you in your dreams.
The way you're describing Bob reminds me of one of my favorite definitions of history. It's Kurt Vonnegut. I think he said, history is just a list of surprises so far, and all it can do is prepare us to be surprised yet again. So it's one of my favorite. There's another similar definition from Paul Graham, which is history is just all the data we have so far. But I like the surprises one better. So staying with the sort of theme of personal time, one way to look at it is Ian's way of like being surprised, beliefs being updated, and so forth. But there's a lot more to like hacking your personal sense of time beyond like just time management or managing your schedule. So Sarah, I think of you as probably the top 1% of personal temporality hackers that I personally know, and you've experimented with everything from like diet to psychotropics to sleep cycles and extreme running. So tell us a little bit about what it means to hack personal time.
It's actually more just a problem I have than hacking, but so I have, it's called non-24 circadian rhythm disorder. Means I don't like go to sleep at night and wake up in the morning. I might be awake for 36 hours and then sleep for 24 and then be awake for 18 and sleep for 9. It's impossible to predict. So I think it makes the world more surreal, just not being, I don't know, it's like an outside view of time a little bit. And I think one thing that made me appreciate ritual is that you kind of need some kind of obstruction. You kind of need some scaffolding or structure to stay in the game, like appreciate the meaning that other people are dealing with, and that's important for being human and being alive. Things like I would try to go running every morning in the non-winter months, whether I've stayed up all night or whether I just woke up. Even though it's not the same sleep cycle, it's at least something that I'm going to see the sunrise every day, regardless of what else is going on. There's one thing about time and drugs that I think is really interesting, marijuana specifically. One of the effects of marijuana, I don't know if anybody's ever used that, but that it tends to narrow the time frame so interfering with memory maybe, I don't think anybody really knows how it works, but having a time frame of maybe 20 seconds of memory. So if you don't get that sentence out fast, it's never going to come out, or 5 seconds even. I think that's a very similar experience to people I've known who had very severe Alzheimer's, who you could feel their personality, they're still in there, but they have maybe 5 seconds of working memory. So a sentence is not going to come out that's coherent, but a clause could. So living in that really shortened time, I think that's kind of an empathetic experience and different. I think every drug does something different to time because time's really complicated. Like Venkat was saying, there's like 40 different things that contribute to the biological clock, whatever that is, and if 3 of those are off, maybe you turn into me or something. So.
Yeah, I don't have much experience with personal temporality hacking, but I have very mundane experiences. Like one of the effects of jet lag to me is that your mind adjusts to the new time faster than your gut, and it's like your gut and digestion cycle are off by 24 hours from your mental cycle. So even if you've beaten the sleep part of the game, you're still on the wrong schedule for eating or something like that. Say a little bit more about like diet and how that affects time. Do you have a sense of that?
For a while, I thought the ketogenic diet cured my non-24, but it didn't. It cured my depression, but it did not cure the non-24. I think meal times can be one of those. Supposedly, meal times are human universal. I don't know if that's true, but I think those can be one of those regulating things. I've never been able to do regular eating, so I don't know, but probably that's something that would be good.
All right. So moving on from personal to, I don't know how to exactly frame this, but I think of it as the relationship between temporality and materiality, which is a fancy way of saying the relationship between your sense of time and the tools and like physical things you use, right? So Ian, let's talk about sort of the content of a lot of your simulations. Is you're imagining a lot of futures with weird sort of prosthetics attached to your brain, or how you experience the world, and multiple personalities. And in one of the short stories you wrote, you have a sentient bicycle that argues with a human character. So give us your sort of techno vision of how the human sense of temporality gets extended through like digital technology and prosthetics.
Yeah, well, I'm trying to write a story right now, well, a cartoon right now that features like a 10-year-old girl who was born with an AI in her brain since she was born, and she can offload kind of tedious activities to this AI. And she gets kind of lost in this neuro game when she's 10, and what feels like 30 seconds in this game is 10 years in her real life, and she wakes up to her 20-year-old self where her AI has made a wreck of her life, has had like 5 marriages, 200 jobs, all kinds of dysfunctional and functional relationships with mom and dad. And she has to decide at that moment, is this mess that the AI made in her name and in her life something to discard and an augmentation that you can say, nope, don't like that? Or is it something that is inherently a part of her holistic landscape of who she has become, and she can, in a way, lean into some or all of that mess? And so it's kind of a way of imagining a future where maybe we decide if AI is part of ourself and can radically affect our time in the way this story kind of cartoonishly depicts, or if it's outside of ourselves. And the example I've read online, I keep forgetting where, but the idea that your limbic system controls your hunger, but you never say my limbic system is hungry, you say I am hungry, and you kind of take ownership of that. But it's a very ancient reptilian part of your mind that's saying that. Now, could we say the same for AI? Like, my AI is saying I'm gonna try to stage like 2 parallel jobs, 2 parallel weddings at once, or is it just part of me that's doing that? But yeah, and I've been thinking also about the hope is that in the future, more people can be more fluent with worlds. This is something that we've been thinking about and talking about on Ribbon Farm. And I think the idea of a world is very tied to the way in which time is controlled by that world. So like, you can think of a world as an institution or a person. Something like Scientology, like it controls some narrative about past lives that then forgive whatever difficulties you have in this life. Or things like Disneyland, they control the line, so they control your time. And I think the more compelling and the more fluid and precise the control of time is for a given world, the more, in a way, seductive and the more desiring you want to stay and participate in that world. So I think temporality and worlding is quite unique and quite linked. And hopefully in the future, I would think and hope that more people are versed in this way of being, so that we're not sick all the time from being sloshed around in all these different worlds, which is our condition at this moment.
As you were speaking, I was thinking of in what ways is the world you're describing kind of already here, right? Like the William Gibson idea of the future is unevenly distributed. So one example that came to mind is, in terms of like worlds that evolved with fine-grained temporalities, Twitter is a great example of like a world that a lot of us kind of inhabit in real time now. And the platforms are gaining like second-level control over the inputs that make us construct the world in real time. And at this point, I have to say, my Twitter world of people is like a little second social brain that's attached to my head, kind of like the AI you're imagining. So I have to say, yeah, I already have an AI inside my head. It's just my Twitter people. Switching from the very digital and AI, the same question I think can be asked of like more material tools. Like Sarah, you experimenting with a lot of like handicraft type stuff, and you're like a stunt knitter, I like to think of it as. And so how does materiality and the use of tools and interacting with like objects, how does that shape our perceptions of time and experience of time?
Well, I learned to knit when I was 6 years old, and I found most of my life I've been going backwards in time with that, because when I learned to knit, I would learn to, make the stitches, put something together out of yarn. And since that, over the past 30-some years, I've just, first of all, tried to go toward, well, where does the yarn come from? And spinning my own yarn. And then, well, where does the wool come from? Learning to not just spin it, but, clean, dye, separate, comb, doing everything. Starting with this kind of pretty rules-based grasp of what I was doing, and then just going backwards kind of in time, but also backwards into the materials. There's a separate point that when you're working on something, you're picturing it and you're trying to imagine what it's going to look like. It's very motivating, like this beautiful thing. It's going to be the most beautiful piece that I've ever done. And also, every piece I'm learning about the materials, learning about what's going on. So there's a temporal organization where this thing is out in the future and I'm heading for it. But once I reach it, it's already obsolete. I don't care about it at all. And it's not that it was never important. It's that it's given some kind of power to drag you through time. And once it's done that, its job is done. And now you've learned what it has to teach you. And now it's kind of like, oh, everybody knows that. So anybody can make this. But the point where you're stretching your skill, you're sort of trying to learn something new, I think is an exciting temporality. It's cool to be pulled forward into the future by this cool thing you're making.
And a big part of that is the learning part, right? Like your bag of beliefs kind of thing. It's like the tug of like chaos versus order in whatever you're doing. And as you're learning more, in hindsight, it looks like it wasn't a big deal, but looking forward, it looks like a big deal, right? And I want to connect that to things you've written about messiness and what a mess is, right? Which is a very odd subject for somebody interested in ritual, because when I think ritual, I think of like order in time and space, and a mess is the opposite of order in time and space. So say a little bit more about your experience of messiness, especially in relation to things like knitting, activities like knitting.
So I'm really messy. I'm not like hoarder level, but really messy. But so mess to me, I've been really interested in mess because I'm like surrounded by it all the time. But I don't think it's the opposite of order or the absence of order. I think it's like order uncanny valley. So perfect order is not a mess, like a perfectly blank wall. Perfect chaos isn't a mess either, like snow, digital snow or something. It doesn't look messy. It just looks like nothing. It's sort of there's so much information in it that it just reads as no information. So there's organization often organized by some particular principle, or sometimes from the ground up by a lot of principles, and that's not a mess either. That's a kind of order, like nature has some nice order from a lot of things. But what I think a mess is when there's multiple organizational strategies that are trying to map the same area, or there's several forms of organization that are in conflict. And I think that's the nature of reality. That's what reality is. So we can perceive it when it's orders that we as humans can perceive, like when there's different fonts or there's a couple pictures superimposed on each other will look kind of messy. But I think also reality is a mess. So a really nice tidy ritual is actually a big mess that is presented in a way that it looks tidy, that the orderly parts of it are emphasized.
And is knitting a way of sort of imposing order on time going forward in the mess,
absolutely.
something like that?
Yeah, absolutely. It's the most effective one I have, probably.
For me, it's tweeting.
Tweeting's good too. Tweeting your knitting is ideal.
It's kind of amazing how digital sort of authorship has actually evolved in that way, right? We've all kind of seen social media go from like long-form blog-like experience to Twitter. It's like you're weaving your thoughts into other people's thoughts in real time. If you want to impose more of your authority on people, you're doing long threads. So there's a kind of like, the image I have in my head is you're almost knitting time into existence. That's kind of why I think knitting is such a good metaphor for experiencing time. So the last topic I have for both of you, it's a little bit more on the philosophical side. So Ian, you and I have both been heavily influenced by James Cars, the philosopher who came up with the idea of finite and infinite games. So for those of you who are not familiar with this book, it's a classic book, first of all, you should read it. And Cars defines a finite game as a game that you play to win, and an infinite game as a game you play to continue playing. And this has been important in my writing. It's a big part of the conversations we have around the blog. And Ian's been heavily influenced by it in constructing his simulations and artwork. So talk about infinite games and, yeah.
Yeah, I think the easiest way for me to think about now is I just had a baby who's 6 months old now. And before baby, she's called Baby Eden, or she's called Eden. Before Baby Eden, I saw everything that I did in very finite game ways, almost like in cinematic ways. Like it was a movie where there was some problem and I was going to get to the end, and when I was done, it was done. And now, after Eden was born, I feel like it's more like the Marvel Cinematic Universe or something, like episodic. It's like every single day is like an episode where the game isn't to like win at anything, it's to like have enough strength, energy, and aliveness to be awake and for her and like just a good parent, and also balance all the other parts of life the next day, and then to do again the next day and the next day and next day. And so like this iterated game, I think, is maybe at the core, the essence of how you pragmatically implement something like an infinite game. It's kind of iterated, maybe finite games, and in the spirit of that iteratedness, you get something like, or a mortal human gets something like what James Carse was describing as an infinite game.
And you've mentioned this explicitly in your book about how you constructed the simulation you're initially a director who's like kind of crafting the experience, then there's like a bunch of human stewards, but at some point you have to let it go to become its own thing and evolve like itself, right? So that's like, that description could be applied to raising a child, right? So it seems like you've been approaching your art as raising children.
Yeah, I mean, with the simulations, there's this artistic process where like I'm highly, highly controlled about what it is I'm doing, like a director. And then I let it into motion, but I'm still kind of a cloying parent, and I want to make sure every little bit of it is still going. And then at a certain point, I want to leave. I don't want to get a call from a collector or museum that this thing needs maintenance in 100 years. It's like a total nightmare. And in the same way, this woman came up to me like in December. She heard I had a baby, and she's like, "Hey, son, I have a 25-year-old daughter, and we have a great relationship, but I'll give you a piece of advice. You have to get divorced from her when she's 12 to 16. If you get divorced from her, she'll come home. But if you never get a divorce from her and you keep being the parent that you were at like age 0 to 4, 5, she's never coming home." So I was shook by that, but it made so much sense to me. A part of a game, a part of a world is sort of letting it go and letting it exit yourself.
So at some point in an infinite game, the way to continue the game is to actually let the game itself go and maybe come back to you.
Exactly. You have to kind of feign a suicide in a way.
And speaking of suicide, so one of the, I think, unpopular opinions and positions Sarah and I share is that we both think suicide is both completely okay and should be condoned by a sane society, and that it's not always a good thing to bring new life into the world. So we are both what is technically known as antinatalists and pro-suicidists. But suicide isn't great. But Sarah, yeah, so in a way, it's not exactly the opposite of an infinite game orientation, but living life with the sense of this is all there is. It's going to end, and it's good to end it, and there's a beginning, and sometimes it's not good to even begin it. So that's what many would consider a very radical kind of framing of just life experience. So how do you live within that particular framing of?
I think most people their response to would you like to live longer is yes, like I would love more life. The problem is not having enough lifespan. And the worst kind of temporality, I think, is where time is a problem that you have to deal with. There's this very, very short future. Even having a few hours ahead of you is like a wall of fear. I don't know how common that experience of temporality is, but I don't think there's any one kind of analytic way of characterizing time. I think there's as many time experiences as there are people. But it's important. I think it's important to be aware the majority probably experience of not having enough time is not universal, and there's a concept of cognitive surplus that's kind of related to this, of having too much time to think, so you need sort of something to suck up your excess mental capacity, like TV, video games, stuff like that. There's maybe such a thing as a time surplus. So I think one sort of a radical solution to that is suicide, of course, but there's a million less radical ways of dealing with time being a problem that's short of that. I think if people think suicide is bad, that's a good way to deal with it. But often, I think public policy around vice, around risk, fails to acknowledge that people have a desire to purchase variance in the sense of just wanting to gamble, wanting to risk it, wanting to have a chance at something different. And if you just regulate things like, oh, gambling is bad, drugs are bad, whatever, they'll switch to the next sort of source of gambling, source of variance. So I don't see that acknowledged a lot, that there's sort of a substitution going on, and that, oh, we can just regulate this particular vice and it'll go away after we just get rid of this drug. And I don't think that's how it works. I think that people are constantly going through time. Suffering people are constantly going through the next hour. And I don't think we have a lot of solutions to offer as a culture for that. It's starting to get better, I think. I think there's a lot of cool things going on, but it can be real scary.
All right, and speaking of time surplus, I think we're doing very well on time, and the hourglass, I don't know how to read an hourglass. But I think I would guess that is 36 minutes with 24 minutes left on the hour. I'm just making that shit up. But okay, so hopefully that gave you guys some good food for thought about how to think about time and all the various aspects of time. And the reason I kind of picked these particular questions to ask Ian and Sarah is, A, I thought they would have interesting things to say about it, but it's sort of the canvas of questions I'm asking in my own research right now, which is what I'm supposed to be doing at Berggruen, writing a book on this stuff. But when I tell people I'm thinking and writing about time, most people start from a very sort of focused, narrow understanding of like, all right, are we talking about like 9-to-5 schedules or how work schedules are changing because of industrialization ending? So there's this much broader canvas with which you can think about time, and that's kind of what I think the three of us have been trying to explore in different ways for, well, several years now. Like I think 2014 is a good starting point for all of us. But with that, we'll stop the on-stage portion of the conversation and open it up to questions. Are there mics circulating or something? Yeah. Raise your hand if you have a question. And
hello. Hi. So I think my question is, you know, there's so much in the human evolution that is supremely designed. I mean, designed exquisitely. And thinking about taking out external factors, there's only so much life in us. There's only so much heartbeats and breaths of air. But our estimation of time is really poor. So why is it our cognitive understanding of time is so bad and everything else is so really well evolved? How would you explain that?
I have a very quick response to that, but after that, Ian and Sarah might have something to chime in with. But I actually disagree with your premise that there is exquisitely well-designed structure to everything else. Like there's this wonderful book I've been reading by Daniel Milo. It's called Good Enough, and it's an exploration of evolution and how everything in nature is kind of mediocre and not actually exquisitely designed. So there's that aspect, and I think our sense of time is about as mediocre as our sense of anything else. So I would say we are kind of par for the course there. But Sarah, Ian, you want to chime in with anything there?
I think clocks are a really new invention and kind of transformed our whole economic system, and I don't think we had co-adapted with clocks. I don't think that clock time is what we adapted with. So yeah, I think people are probably pretty good at time as far as what was important before like 1400 or something, like when to eat or when to get up in the morning. Not me, but most people. I'm not exquisitely designed.
Yeah, I just think people are so driven by their motivations, and the more their motivations are aligned on longer-term timescales, the more they have to think by nature more precisely about time. Like if you had the idea that you're going to move to, I don't know, San Francisco in a year, then you start to plan for it in all these little ways starting now. But if your motivation, whether through circumstance or privilege, is just quite short, you can't think more than what you're going to do the next minute to survive or to get through this time hell, like you're saying, of next few hours being so difficult to overcome, then your time is warped by your motivation. And I think motivation strongly structures your perception. It's like we don't see in reality as it is. We see it based on whatever current motivation we're sensing, and everything's a tool, an obstacle, or just totally, completely irrelevant.
I actually have something else I want to say on that. That I think there's a pattern I've been noticing that I think is really common of humans build a really cool tool and then look down on themselves for not being as good as the tool when they made the tool to do it better than them in the first place. I think clocks and computers are, yeah.
And there's a sort of, it may not be exquisitely designed, but it's appropriately designed. Like, for example, what's known as hyperbolic discounting and how we sort of weight near-term and long-term rewards in weirdly different ways. It may not make sense in the incentive structure of, say, a modern economy and labor force, but it might make a lot of sense if you're kind of a hunter-gatherer dealing with seasonality, right? So I like to think a little bit in terms of reverse engineering, not this is bad as compared to a clock, but what is this good for and what kind of environment might that have been? Yeah. Right, more questions? Oh, and if you have a specific question to one of us, yeah, just call one of us out.
Hi. I'm surprised that musical composition hasn't really been addressed. For me, one of the pivotal things in the world of music and composition and time is John Cage's piece, 4 minutes and 33 seconds,
Yeah.
which puts you in hyper contact with your surroundings. And when it's over, it's over. And yet there's some mental gymnastics that you can go through during that slice of time, which focuses your sensibility on the minutia of what surrounds you. And that technique of taking a slice of time and bookending it in a very powerful aesthetic manner seems to be a really significant way to think about time. And then, you know, other composers, Terry Riley, Steve Reich, et cetera, deal with time in a slightly less minimal way, but nevertheless manage to make a kind of concreteness out of it. So,
one quick question on our response to that before I hand it over to, I think both Sarah and Ian have a lot more thoughts on music than I do. But before this conversation started, I was talking to Julian, who's doing the DJing for this event and picking the music, and I asked him, I'm not much of a musician either as a listener or producer. I don't listen to much, I don't make any. But I asked Julian what kind of music he was deciding to play for this event, and he said, I'm picking more intellectual, minimalist, pure music. And I asked him, what do you normally do? And he says, oh, I do more techno and house. So that's my comment on music, but yeah, Sarah, Ian, what do you have to say about music and time?
I mean, just from the art bend, I just want to say, I mean, it's not to do with music, but the first time I saw Christian Mark The Clock, you know, I don't know if you're familiar with this piece, but he's edited together a 24-hour cycle using film clips. And I mean, if you've ever watched a clock, like when you're in 5th grade in class and waiting 5 minutes for recess, like 5 minutes can be so forever. But I've never felt an experience where every minute was so enthralling. And for me, it was a very balanced marriage of Chronos time and kairotic time, where you had the literal clock and you could watch this thing for hours, but because every moment was taken from a movie, and usually like usually juicy moments from a movie, like rarely opportune moments in a movie. It was, for me, the perfect kind of balance of these two forces of time that I hadn't really quite seen so clearly distilled, and this reminded me a lot of your Cage comment.
Yeah, I think what makes the piece art and not a stunt is that unfolding in time. The same thing as with a narrative, with a novel or a movie. I think what's important is the mental state of coming up with maybe predictions and then seeing what happens and altering the mental model of it. And what you're describing sounds like that same experience of going through those 4 minutes and 30 seconds, being very aware, having a progression, your thoughts are changing in your head, like Ian was saying, when you're thinking about things. So yeah, it's cool. I'm very ignorant about music. I was just recently trying to figure out how deep the metaphor goes between color harmony and musical harmony, and it turns out not very deep. But I think color harmony is more similar to overtones in music. I don't know. That's my thinking.
Yeah, music is. It hasn't been front and center for me in my thinking, partly because I'm trying to think of time in like a more expansive, beyond human way, and then you get into things like, do animal species have music? Like one of the interesting bits of research I read was songbirds in Pacific Islands, they actually rehearse their songs as they sleep at night. So music is kind of somewhere there in our DNA, but I haven't yet made up my mind on how much or how it interacts with temporality in specific ways. Okay, so that's all I think. Yeah.
But I think also in music, you generate this feeling, right, in a person. You're almost like neurologically beaming someone a feeling, which is sort of like an emotion with some context to it. It reminded me a lot of when perfumers make perfumes, they're trying to generate a feeling, which is a context, this kind of space, like sandy beach on your first date. And somehow they can distill that feeling in a bottle or in a 3-minute song or a 4-minute 33 composition. Somehow that neurological transmission of this memory, feeling, space is almost more important than the time, hopefully, than the time it took to feel that experience.
That aspect is actually one of the most interesting research areas right now, sort of the emotional contagion aspect of music. So I saw this study recently of musicians performing actually connected over the internet, and their brains, their brainwave patterns, they're actually more in sync than our normal sense of time. So when you're, say, playing a piece of music with another musician, you're actually sort of harmonized in time much more accurately than if, for example, we tried to do something less musical in a coordinated way, like lift a table or something. So, and that's kind of why, if you're rowing a boat, you might have like a chant or something like that to synchronize time. All right. More questions?
Or fulling the wool, that's one where you sing songs and do it in a particular rhythm with sitting around a table.
This is working. There's something, this one I've been thinking about for a while, but why do the good times pass faster than the bad times? And for the time hackers, how can we make the good times to go a little bit slower and the bad times to go fast?
Well, first of all, I can't see who asked that question and where you are. All right, you're behind the glare of the lights. So I can quickly respond to that. There's a lot of literature on what kinds of environmental stimuli affect time perception in some ways. And there's a famous quote that's, I think, apocryphally attributed to Einstein that, if you're sitting on a hot stove, it feels, for a minute, it feels like an hour. But if you've got a pretty girl sitting on your lap, hour feels like a minute, from a different era, that kind of comment. But since then, there have been a lot more research studies, and it turns out there's not that many super reliable actual correlations between what actually makes time seem to go fast versus slow. So the research is all over the place, so yeah.
Yeah, you really notice it when you're in LSD.
I would say get surprised a lot.
There's one experiment I want to mention which is kind of interesting. So David Eagleman, who's one of the top researchers on time, he did this clever experiment where people fell from, a Disneyland theme park type ride, the kind where you fall from a tower. And he had this clever experimental setup of how much do people falling in that state of anxiety and terror, how fast do they think time is flowing versus an observer on the ground. And it turns out that the person who's falling thinks that time lasts between 30 to 40% longer than an observer on the ground, but that's just the feeling of time. They aren't actually living in slow motion, and they did a very clever experimental design where they actually checked, are you actually seeing time slow down, like Neo in the Matrix dodging bullets? Turns out it's not that cool. You just feel time is going more slowly, but you can't actually dodge bullets.
So meaning is a topic that you guys have written about before, and there's a certain connection there where we identify with long-scale narratives like the type that you were talking about to get more meaning in our lives, like religious narratives. But there's also a sense in which being very tightly coupled in a very short time, like something like knitting, also produces this deep experience of meaning. So I'm curious what you think the relationship is between the experience of meaning and different time scales.
Whoa. It seems to me in my own life, the more meaning meaning comes when a lot of things are somehow aligned. Like, I don't know, like coming to LA to meet Venkat in person for the first time also aligns with wanting to have this other conversation about cartoons with him later, which also aligns with his motivation to ask me about this game, which aligns with, I don't know, making a new friend, you know? And so when all these things come into alignment, it seems more meaningful. It's almost like it's hitting all the different temporal levels in a way, very short-term things and potentially very infinite game long-term things. I don't know, that's maybe my thought on that.
Sarah, you've written a bunch about like everything that's meaningful is sort of illusory and transient in some sense. I think that connects here, right?
I would say we think of meaning as the thing, the positive phenomenon. I kind of suspect lack of meaning is the positive phenomenon that comes from suffering, from being either outside of a big story, outside of a small kind of goal-oriented activity. So I think people don't, even if people have really, you know, aren't engaged in a lot of meaningful things, they probably won't report a lack of meaning unless there's also like a suffering kind of situation involved. So yeah, I think, like I was saying with the knitting thing, where you're picturing this beautiful thing and it's dragging you through time, you could see that as it's always an illusion, right? It's always lying to you. But I don't think that's quite, like, I don't want to judge it like that, because yeah, it's kind of an illusion, but I mean, your brain's making illusions all the time. So yeah, it's real for that time. Why does it have to be real forever? Nothing's forever, so.
But you are onto, I think, a very strong intuition that's validated by a lot of research, that there is a strong connection between the experience of meaning and the experience of time itself. So two papers that I've been reading get at this in a strong way. One is the effect of torture on prisoners of war and the sort of post-traumatic stress that follows. And because you've been in that experience of having another human sort of in a hostile way control every aspect of your life, your sense of time actually completely collapses. And one of the hardest things in recovering from that kind of trauma is reconstructing and rebuilding your sense of time. And you see this in weaker ways with weaker kinds of meaning loss. So Professor Henry Jenkins, I think at USC, has done a bunch of studies of like older boomers in declining parts of the US and asking them a question like, how do you imagine the healthcare system in the country in, say, 2060 or something like that? And because they're in such a state of hopelessness, they can't actually imagine like fairly mundane things. So there's a strong relationship between, you know, being able to live in time and experience a sense of time and the meaningfulness of your life. More questions? Who has the microphone? Someone? Oh, yeah.
Is it me? Okay. I want to take a turn for the silly, and since we've been talking about gaming, I just want to make a point about how gaming ruined temporality for me, or temporality ruined gaming. In several years ago, there was back in when the Game Boy existed. I remember playing a game when there was a tally of the total time that you spent playing it, and by the end of the game, it turns out that I had been 14 hours playing it, and that was such an anticlimax because, you know, in those 14 hours, I had already saved the world. I was a Pokemon champion or whatever. It was one of those games. And after that, it's like, okay, but this has only been like 14 hours in my life. And while I understand that that had a purpose probably of parent control, of kind of controlling how much time kids spend in the games, it was a harsh switch back to real time. And that ruined gaming for me because I saw the game cartridge as 12 hours of my life and not as a whole experience of having conquered this world. And from then on, every game box that I could saw, I was like, okay, how many hours of my life is this? So I was buying entertainment for 14 hours, for 15 hours. So now the point that I want to make for this is that I found it amazing how quickly we transfer from an understanding of a completely parallel time lapse, like, okay, you're a fictional character in your game, the kind of Narnia effect where, okay, you're in a different world and years pass in only days. And then, and how quickly we can switch back to real time. So I guess the conclusion I want to make from all this is that I kind of question how hard it would be for us to adapt to completely alternative time structures if such a situation presented itself. With the ease in which we can switch into time modes and different time modes in games, I mean, if tomorrow, weeks started having 3-day weekends or weeks were 10 days long, I mean, I don't think there would be an innate resistance to doing that. And so I guess that's just kind of off my head reflection I wanted to share. Thank you.
Ian, you want to respond to that? That's right in your ballpark.
I think you're describing the burden of Chronos. Like, some things don't need chronological time to make it feel valuable. And whatever, that Pokemon Championship felt just fine on its own. It's like that screen time utility on your iPhone that tells you how much you've been on Instagram or whatever, and it's just totally depressing. And it can be a corrective too, of course, at the same time. But yeah, I think this is the burden of maybe this idea of Chronos, which has been so mastered now, with GPS, with computers being much better at our time, being our timekeepers and reminding us of how much we've wasted our time. And it seems to me that there's a shift back, or at least from what I understand, Venkat, your project is right now, how a new model of time that could integrate this subjective time, this objective time, and how you can manipulate it in more new and interesting ways is already here, and then just requires, I think, more literacy and mastery. So I don't know, it's maybe a shift back away from that jarring moment you felt when you looked at how much time was spent doing this subjective activity.
All right, I think we are at the end of an hour plus T, where T is an uncertain quantity of time, which I couldn't track with the sand. So I think we stop here now. Any closing thoughts from you two?
Time's up.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.